Japanese writing is a complex writing system. It uses several forms of graphic symbols that are based on characters borrowed from China, and it is called Japanese Kanji. Some scholars say that Japan already had its own writing system when the characters were first brought over. Many artifacts have characters on them, which means that the Japanese probably learned about the Chinese characters pretty early. Chinese coins found in Japan date back to about the 1st century AD. Meanwhile, clay items and other everyday objects with characters also pressed on them go back to the 4th century. With that said, most historians agree that the Japanese began to study and use characters around the time Buddhism began to spread in Japan. It happened in the middle of the 6th century when delegates from the Korean Principality Kudara came to Japan with generous gifts such as sculptures of Buddhas and handwritten texts of Buddhist writings. When the Chinese characters were first borrowed, the texts were read in Chinese, the so-called kanbun or Chinese texts, which was the language of all state affairs. At the time, the need to record the spoken language and the creation of historical and literary monuments led to the emergence of the Japanese own written language. The poetry collection called Manyoshu, which means collection of 10,000 leaves, appeared in the 8th century. The book brought the turning point in development of Japanese writing. Some of the characters in it were connected to their original meanings and were read by onyomi or Chinese reading rules. The others had the phonetic function. They are kind of syllabic symbols called manyogana. The kanji writing system was named Manyogana Majiribun, which was character writing with some Manyogana characters. Manyogana was a shortened way of character writing with more rounded lines. Hiragana and katakana syllabic scripts came from Manyogana, which was used to help reading Chinese texts, written with a special symbol system called kunten. There was no unified set of rules for writing the characters of these scripts, which often led to confusion. Yet, by the 10th century, the rules were defined and katakana became independent symbols of the alphabet, not auxiliary symbols for kunten. So, the cursive forms of the characters of Manyogana alphabet became hiragana symbols, and its short forms became katakana symbols. While the Japanese writing was developing in Japan, two ways of writing formed, which are kanbun or Chinese writing, and wabun or Japanese writing. Kanbun was the language of the high style, the language of imperial edicts, business and science. Wabun was used mostly in literature. In the 16th century, Japan came in touch with European culture for the first time. The Japanese mostly met with Portuguese and Spanish missionaries and traders. Now, new borrowed words and foreign names had to be written down. To do that, the Japanese started to use the symbols of katakana syllabic script. Katakana and hiragana scripts had the same set of readings, but in writing, katakana had shorter spellings and sharper strokes. Katakana and hiragana were not only created from the same set of characters. In the 19th century, namely in 1867 to 1868, the government was overthrown in the so-called Meiji Restoration, or Meiji-shin in Japanese, which gave the power back to the emperor. He carried out several important reforms in the country, such as the writing reform. The aim of this reform was to make people more literate, but it did not bring about the modern form of character writing. Yet, the reform cut the number of characters and established the unified set of rules for symbols of both scripts or kana, that is, hiragana and katakana. The reforms of 1946 to 1949 after the war created the modern Japanese writing. Thanks to them, it became much easier to use kana. It was still called gojuon, or 50 phonetic symbols, but some symbols were cut out from the final columns because they had the same readings as the symbols from the first column. So, the script now had 46 symbols. A character minimum called the list of characters to be used was also introduced. It had 1,850 characters, and the writings of many of them were much simpler. A small number of them had alternative writings. Later, other reforms set even stricter rules for writing and reading Japanese characters. Reading the characters. Each character has one or more readings. Most characters have an upper reading, which is called onyomi. This is a Japanized Chinese reading. There can be one, and maybe two, and even three readings. Usually, these readings are written with the katakana symbols, which we will be discussing in Lesson 5. On this slide, you can see them. They are marked in green. So, in the first character, meaning day, sun, there are two readings, nichi and jitsu. And for the second character, with the meaning basis, there is only one reading, hon. Together, they form the word Nihon or Nippon, which means Japan. There are also characters which do not have such a reading. These are the characters that were invented in Japan and are called kokuji. They only have a Japanese reading. These Japanese readings are called kunyomi and are written in the hiragana symbols. They are also called lower readings. There may be many Japanese readings, and their meanings may differ completely from one another. The slide depicts a character with two Chinese on readings and several Japanese kun readings. All kun readings except for nama are verbs. All the given readings of this character are used very heavily and must be learned by heart, which is one of the difficulties of Japanese language. The symbols of hiragana, which were written after the character, are called okurigana. They indicate a change in the form of the word. Before we start writing Japanese symbols, be they characters or symbols of either script, we must consider the rules for writing them. People often wonder, what are all these details and rules for? It makes no difference which stroke to make first. What should matter is that it looks okay in the end. Perhaps the arguments that oppose this opinion are, such as, rules exist due to the fact that initially the characters were written with a brush. They contributed to the free movement of the brush on the surface. Also, all elements and directions of the strokes are put into an order which provides easy visual perception and a quick recognition of a character. Moreover, fixed elements and a fixed stroke order help memorizing the characters more easily and reproduce them even if you have difficulty remembering some part of the character. Furthermore, judging by the way Japanese themselves respect the art of calligraphy, the rules for writing Japanese characters are very important. Everyone does calligraphy in Japan, regardless of their age. Plus, calligraphy exhibitions and calligraphy contests takes place all year round. So, here is rule number 1. When we write a character or a kana symbol, in our mind, we place it in a square. To make it easier, take graph ruled paper and line it into squares of 2 by 2. But since we are only starting to write Japanese characters, it is better to make squares of 3 by 3. Then our symbols will be larger, and hand movements will be less constrained. Now we can write symbols keeping to the center of the 3 by 3 square. We must make sure that the character does not split across the width of the square and does not stretch along its length. We also try to ensure that all characters and kana symbols are of the same size and that there are gaps between them. Otherwise, parts of characters placed next to each other might get jumbled. It is okay if kana symbols are slightly smaller than the characters, but they should not be too small. The difference between them should be minimal. Rule number 2 concerns the order of strokes. There are 9 basic principles to follow. 1. All symbols are written from left to right. 2. From top to bottom. 3. If there are intersecting strokes in the symbol, then we draw horizontal strokes first, and only when we move on to vertical ones. 4. If there is a central element in the symbol, it is drawn first. Then we draw what is on the left, and only then. what is on the right. 5. If there is a vertical stroke in the symbol that passes through the entire character, then it is the last stroke to be drawn. 6. If there is a horizontal stroke in the symbol that passes through the entire character, then it is the last stroke to be drawn. 7. The closed frame rule is introduced here. First, you open the frame. In other words, you draw an open frame. Then you write what is supposed to be inside, and only then you close the frame with a horizontal line. 8. The character field and all similar characters are written, such as first an open frame, then a central vertical line followed by a horizontal line in the middle, and then a closing horizontal line. 9. The falling strokes rule is presented here. You start with the stroke falling leftwards, and then you move on the one falling rightwards, even if they intersect, as we see in the fumi character, meaning writing, literature. We have already seen more familiar falling strokes in the hon character from the word Nihon at the beginning of this lesson. Let's take a break now. Next time, we will talk about one more rule for writing Japanese characters. And now, finally, it's time to start writing hiragana symbols. For today, we have 2 rows of 5 characters each. Each character will be accompanied by a transcription and a word for easier memorization and associate perception. As the Japanese put it, we will capitalize the symbols carrying the stress. Before we begin, I must say that it is better to start writing Japanese characters with a soft pencil. By doing this, you will be able to see if your strokes are drawn correctly and to focus especially on the right points to apply pressure, on how smooth the curves are, etc. So, now look at the first 5 symbols. I would like you to focus on the writing of the symbol A and the symbol O. They are quite similar. However, A's upper horizontal line is longer than that of O, which also has a dot that many people often forget to draw at the level of horizontal line. The symbol I is slightly round to the left. And we remember that the right stroke, so to speak, continues the left one. Raising your hand over, drawing the first line, you mentally draw a semicircle and touch the paper with your pencil at the top dot. This is where you continue the line. When writing the symbols U and E, you must keep strictly to the central vertical line. On this slide, you see the row with the consonant K. Here it is the symbols Ki and Ko that should attract our attention. Similarly, as in the case of the symbol I, interrupting lines means continuing them. If we don't keep this in mind, the symbols can turn out too flat and the lower strokes can go to the side. which makes them visually unappealing. When writing symbols ku and ke, we must keep the central vertical line to prevent the symbols from splitting to the sides. This concludes today's lesson. You can practice writing a and ka by printing out the samples of writing from the reference section. When writing characters, remember the rules of the stroke order